Hello everyone, and today I'm going to be continuing my gemstone series. So last time I used amethyst, and today I'm going to be using jadeite. So the paint that I'm going to be using is Jadeite Genuine by Daniel Smith, and I'll show a little footage right here. So this watercolor is made just from gum arabic and genuine jadeite, so that's super cool. This paint is really beautiful. I'll show some swatches here, and I think that I'm gonna stick with a very similar theme to last time, because now I plan on doing a series of 3 total, and I'm going to stick with a sort of gothic window stained glass feel. I don't know if I'm gonna go for the same thickness and darkness of lines. I haven't fully decided yet, but come join along with me and I'll show a little bit of my preparation process before we jump into the painting as a whole. Okay, so the first step that I took was to do sort of a thumbnail sketch. Last time I used my sketchbook, but this time I felt like digital would help me to explore the colors and shapes a little more. And after that, I just did a little bit of line work just to kind of map out the shapes that I wanted to use for the actual painting. So jumping into the process itself, I started off with just a base wash in the shape of the window, and then slowly started blocking in the different colors. I started off with the sky, kind of adding a little bit of depth where I could, but I knew that I was going to layer onto this later, so I really was just focusing on mapping out shapes at this point. I also do want to mention that my prep work really paid off in this step, because I didn't really have to think about what colors I was going to use. I'd sort of already mapped those out earlier on. I've probably said mapped a lot at this point, but I'd already picked the colors earlier on, and so I was able to just mix the colors to the best of my ability and try to match them to get the effects that I wanted. Now, of course it isn't perfect, since it's pretty hard to get the digital vibrancy that is present on the color comp and practice, but I think I got pretty close near the end. So around this point, I was already getting a little impatient and really wanted to add in the frame of the window, so I took some acrylic ink and painted in the border. Now, one thing that is a little sad about traditional art, or at least at my skill level, is that I'm unable to get it to look quite as crisp and even as in the digital model. But, you know, that's life, and it's okay. But I really enjoyed using the acrylic ink for this, because for those of you who don't know, acrylic ink dries down completely and you can't re-wet it. So it's great for borders and line work and being used alongside watercolor, because you can't lift up that paint. Whereas if that was watercolor, I'd be afraid of re-wetting it at any point and having those colors bleed into the rest of the painting. Now, this part with the trees is probably what took me the longest. Here, I'm just adding in these sort of jaggedy shapes. My inspiration was that it was either going to be, again, like I mentioned earlier, stained glass, but I also kind of wanted to paint it a little how one would paint gemstones, and I end up adding quite a bit onto this later on, but just because of all the shapes and trying to make it sharp in appearance, it definitely took a little bit longer to paint. And there was a few times that I kind of went off script and didn't quite follow the line work. And looking back, I actually do like how it was before I end up adding some stuff to it later. but ultimately I do think that what I end up changing added more contrast and interest into the art piece. So at this point, I found that these really bright spaces were starting to look a little too close to white, and they didn't feel like they really fit in. And so I did a little glaze over it, and while that did make some of the edges of the gem shards, I guess you could say, I knew that I was going to paint over that later, so I wasn't too worried about that. And this is sort of the point where I start filling in some more of the details and adding in a little bit more contrast. I will also say that I got the chance to use a lot of colors that I don't normally reach for. For example, I used a lot of phthalo green, which normally for a green is a very unnatural color, but because I was going for a really vibrant shade, it was perfect. And I also got to use a little bit of cobalt teal, and I really enjoyed working with these colors, and reminds me why it's fun to try these different kinds of projects and sort of stretch myself a little bit. While I was planning out this piece, I looked at a lot of stained glass windows, and I noticed that a lot of them had these sort of wavy patterns that were more rounded, especially for skies and land, and I really wanted to incorporate that here. It was also a great way for me to kind of add in part of the cloud that I missed earlier, and this was one of my favorite parts to paint, and I think it really added some more interest to the piece. I also just love painting wavy lines, and I'm always looking for more places to incorporate them. And here I painted a little bit off camera, and originally I was just going to add a little bit of depth to the shards, not realizing that I was going to go a little ham and add a lot more. And I started painting them a lot more crystal-like and adding not necessarily different shades of green, but different tones of green. Different, I guess shades would be right, different light and dark shades of green, adding in bits of yellow and blue just to add a little more visual interest. If I were to redo this, I would probably plan out the shapes a little more, but like I said before, I pretty much vowed not to redo this piece after what happened last time. I think I forgot to mention this earlier, but I specifically used the Jadeite pigment paint on these shards, and oh my goodness, the green is just so beautiful. Unfortunately, it's really hard to capture on camera, but you can actually see sort of the sparkles and shimmers from the actual mineral itself, and it's really beautiful in sunlight. It sort of glimmers, and later on I actually use this paint in the most saturated, thick form I could get it as the line work because I just thought it was so beautiful. Now, at this point, I'm mostly just adding in some little details, adding some line work, and deepening some of the colors that I already placed down, just to add a little bit more definition. At least the final details I do with watercolor. You'll see that pretty soon here I'm going to bring in some other materials as well. Now, I definitely could have left it without these extra details, but I have a hard time leaving things alone. I think I have that so-called too much gene, and so I tried to add just a little more dimension and shimmer with some colored pencils. And I could have definitely been more thoughtful about some of these details, but it's not often that I get carried away and it turns out good, and in this case, it actually did. For example, I took this bright green Posca pen and started adding some outlines into the trees, and the more I added, the more I actually really liked how it looked, and I got a little carried away with it, but I'm also not mad at it. And after all these finishing details, here is the final product. And with that, I am finished. Thank you all for watching. Please let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos, and I'll see you again in the next week or so. Bye!